The bright lights of Europa Station's commercial district shone down on 15-year-old Taiwan as he walked through the crowded hallway. The year was 2157, and humanity had spread across the solar system. The space station, which orbited Jupiter's icy moon Europa, was home to over 10,000 people. Taiwan wore his favorite blue jacket with the Space Force logo on it. His father had given it to him on his last birthday. He moved carefully through the crowd, holding his tablet close to his chest. The device helped him communicate when speaking became difficult. Even though medicine had advanced greatly in the future, Down syndrome still existed, and Taiwan had learned to live with it proudly. The boy stopped at a window that looked out into space. Jupiter filled most of the view, its great red spot swirling like a giant storm eye. Taiwan loved this spot. It reminded him of his father's stories about flying through space. He pulled out his tablet and started taking pictures of the view. "Hey, you, what are you doing there?" a loud voice called out. Two interstellar security officers approached him. Their black uniforms and silver badges showed they were station police. The taller one, Officer Han, looked at Taiwan with unfriendly eyes. His partner, Officer Park, stood slightly behind him with a smirk on his face. Taking pictures," Taiwan said slowly, showing them his tablet. He tried to speak clearly, just as he had practiced with his speech therapist. Officer Han grabbed the tablet roughly from Taiwan's hands. "This is a restricted area," he said, even though it wasn't. The commercial district was open to everyone. "No restricted," Taiwan said firmly. He knew the station rules well. His father had made sure of that. "Public area. Please return my tablet." Officer Park laughed unkindly. "Listen to how he talks," he said to his partner. "They let anyone on this station these days." A small group of people began to gather nearby, watching the scene unfold. Among them was a young merchant named Yu Hyun, who quietly activated his communication device to record what was happening. "I want go home now," Taiwan said, reaching for his tablet. He remembered what his father always told him. "Stay calm, be polite, and if someone is unkind, try to leave safely." Officer Han held the tablet higher, out of Taiwan's reach. "What's wrong? Can't reach it," he taunted. "Maybe if you evolved properly, you'd be taller." Tears formed in Taiwan's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. His father had taught him about dignity. He stood straight and looked directly at Officer Han. "That is wrong thing to say," he stated clearly. "Please give tablet. I call my father." "Oh, he's going to call his daddy," Officer Park mocked. "I'm so scared. What's Daddy going to do? Is he the janitor?" The crowd grew larger. Some people looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward to help. Do Hyun's recording was already streaming live across the station's social network, where thousands of people were beginning to watch. A young woman in a lieutenant's uniform stood at the edge of the crowd. Lieutenant Sun Mei recognized Taiwan immediately. How could she not? Just last week, she had attended a briefing where his father had outlined plans for humanity's next great leap into deep space. She touched her communication badge, sending an urgent message up the chain of command. "When my father comes," Taiwan started to say, but Officer Han cut him off. "When your father comes, what? What's he going to do about it? Look at you. You can barely speak properly. People like you shouldn't be in space. You should be in some facility back on Earth." Taiwan's hands formed into fists, but he kept them at his sides. He wouldn't fight. He wouldn't cry. He would make his father proud. "My father says, all humans deserve respect," he said slowly and clearly. "Even ones who act mean, like you." Officer Park stepped closer, his face twisted with anger at being called mean. "Listen here, you little." The officer's words were cut off by the sound of heavy boots approaching. The crowd parted like water, and a tall figure in an admiral's uniform stepped through. Admiral Jihu Kim's face was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury as he looked at the scene before him. Officer Han still held Taiwan's tablet in the air, frozen in place as he realized something had changed. He didn't know yet exactly who had arrived, but the crowd's reaction told him it was someone important. Taiwan smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Hello, Father," he said clearly, his voice full of love and pride. Admiral Ji Hoo Kim stood perfectly still, his dark uniform decorated with medals that told stories of great space battles and peaceful first contacts. His eyes moved from his son to the tablet still held high in Officer Han's hand. The officer's arm slowly lowered as he began to understand just how much trouble he was in. "Taiwan," Admiral Kim said softly, "are you hurt?" "No, Father," Taiwan replied. "Just my feelings, but I remembered what you taught me about being strong." The Admiral nodded, his face showing pride in his son's composure. He turned to Lieutenant Sun Mei, who stood at attention nearby. "Lieutenant, please take my son to get some ice cream. I believe the shop around the corner has his favorite chocolate flavor." As Taiwan left with the lieutenant, Admiral Kim faced the two officers. The crowd watched in complete silence. Everyone on the station knew who Admiral Kim was, the man who had made first contact with the Aldebaran aliens, who had saved 3 colonies from space pirates, and who had changed the Space Force's rules to welcome people of all abilities. Officer Han and Officer Park. The Admiral said their names calmly, reading their badges. "Do you know what I was doing exactly 20 years ago today?" The officers shook their heads, their faces pale with fear. "I was on Earth, in an adoption center, meeting my son for the first time." Admiral Kim's voice carried clearly through the silent corridor. "The social workers told me that because of his Down syndrome and his background, many families had passed him by. But when I looked in his eyes, I saw something special. I saw the future." Do Hyun, the merchant, kept recording. His live stream now had over 50,000 viewers across the solar system. That same year, the Admiral continued, "I was planning humanity's first meeting with alien life. Many people worried that the aliens wouldn't accept us because we were different from them. And do you know what I learned from that experience?" Officer Park's voice trembled as he asked, "What, sir?" "I learned that true strength isn't about physical power or perfect genes. It's about how we treat those who are different from us." The Admiral stepped closer to the officers. "The Aldebarans didn't judge us by our looks or how we spoke. They judged us by our hearts." Officer Han finally found his voice. "Sir, we didn't know he was your son, and that makes it acceptable." Admiral Kim's voice became sharper. "Should it matter whose son he is? Would it be right to treat anyone's child this way?" The Admiral reached out and took the tablet from Officer Han's loose grip. He looked at it carefully, checking for damage. The screen showed the picture Taiwan had taken of Jupiter's swirling storms. "My son loves space," Admiral Kim said, his voice softening again. "He can name every moon of Jupiter. He knows the chemical composition of Europa's ocean by heart. He dreams of being a science officer one day. And despite what you might think, he understands everything you said to him. Every cruel word, every mocking laugh." The crowd had grown even larger. Among them were other Space Force officers, station workers, and civilians. Many were recording now, knowing they were witnessing an important moment. 20 years ago, I made 2 promises," the Admiral continued. "One to my son, that I would always protect him and help him reach for the stars, and one to the Space Force, that I would help make it a place where everyone, no matter their appearance, abilities, or background, could find their place among the stars." He looked directly at the officers, his gaze firm but not unkind. "Today, you've made me realize how much work we still have to do. But I want you to understand something. This isn't the end of your careers. This is an opportunity for all of us to learn and grow. Because that's what humanity does best. We learn, we adapt, and we become better." In the ice cream shop around the corner, Taiwan sat with Lieutenant Sun Mei, enjoying his chocolate ice cream. He wasn't angry anymore. He knew his father would turn this bad moment into something good. He always did. The crowd in Europa Station's commercial district grew larger with each passing minute. Do-hyun's live stream had now reached over 100,000 viewers across the solar system. His hands were steady as he kept recording, knowing that this moment would be important for the future of the Space Force. Officer Park shifted uncomfortably under Admiral Kim's steady gaze. Instead of accepting the lesson with grace, anger and embarrassment made him speak up again. "Sir, with all due respect," he said, his voice shaking, "how can we maintain proper security standards if we keep lowering our requirements? Some people just aren't meant for space travel." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Even Officer Han looked at his partner in shock. The Admiral's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew more intense. "Lower our standards," Admiral Kim repeated quietly. "Officer Park, let me tell you about standards. Last month, my son noticed a small error in the station's oxygen recycling data that everyone else had missed. His different way of seeing patterns helped prevent what could have become a serious problem." The Admiral stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent corridor. The day before that, he spent 3 hours helping an elderly couple learn how to use the station's new communication system. And this morning, before he decided to harass him, he was working on a project to help other children with disabilities better understand space science. Do-hyun's recording device captured every word. Comments flooded in from viewers across the solar system. Many shared their own stories of discrimination in space. Others expressed their support for Admiral Kim and his son. Lieutenant Sun Mai returned with Taiwan, who now held a small cup of chocolate ice cream. The boy walked straight to his father's side, standing tall despite the stares from the crowd. A bit of ice cream had dripped onto his blue jacket, but he didn't seem to mind. "Father," Taiwan said clearly, "may I show them my project?" Admiral Kim smiled warmly. "Of course, son." Taiwan took his tablet back from his father and, with steady fingers, pulled up a presentation. He turned the screen so everyone could see. On it was a carefully designed teaching program that used simple pictures and clear words to explain complex space concepts to children with different learning needs. "I make this," Taiwan said proudly, "to help everyone understand space. Because space is for everybody." Officer Park's face turned red. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Officer Han finally found his courage and grabbed his partner's arm. "Stop," Han whispered. "Just stop." But Park pulled away. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "The Space Force isn't a charity. We can't have people like him." "People like him." A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Captain Yumho, the station's chief medical officer, pushing through the crowd. "Officer Park, did you know that people with Down syndrome often have exceptional visual awareness and attention to detail? Did you know they frequently show higher emotional intelligence than average? These are valuable traits in space, where small details can mean the difference between life and death." The captain walked over to stand beside Taiwan and the Admiral. "I've reviewed this young man's project," he continued. "It's brilliant in its simplicity. It will help not just children with disabilities, but anyone who wants to learn about space in a clear, straightforward way." Taiwan smiled at the captain's words, then turned to Officer Park. "Would you like to try my program?" he asked kindly, holding out his tablet. "It might help you understand better." The sincerity in Taiwan's offer, his willingness to help someone who had just been cruel to him, made the moment even more powerful. Do-hyun's live stream exploded with comments of support and admiration. Officer Park stared at the offered tablet, his face a mix of confusion and shame. In that moment, he realized that the person he had mocked for being different was showing more maturity and kindness than he had managed in his entire career. Lieutenant Sun Mei Lee stood quietly at the edge of the growing crowd, watching the scene unfold. Her crisp uniform felt heavy with responsibility as she observed Officer Park's continued resistance. She had served under Admiral Kim for only 3 months, but those months had taught her more about leadership than her entire time at the Space Academy. She remembered her first meeting with Taiwan clearly. It had happened during her initial briefing with the Admiral. She had been nervous, fresh from Earth assignment, when Ta-1 walked into his father's office with a tray of tea. The boy had carefully served each person in the room, remembering exactly how everyone liked their drinks. Now, watching him offer his tablet to Officer Park, she felt a familiar warmth in her chest. This was why she had joined the Space Force, not just to explore the stars, but to be part of something bigger than herself. "Lieutenant," Admiral Kim's voice brought her back to the present. "Please share what you witnessed when you first arrived at this scene." Sun Mei stepped forward, her voice clear and professional. "Yes, sir. I arrived to find Officers Han and Park harassing your son. They were mocking his speech patterns and making derogatory comments about his presence on the station. Officer Han had taken Tai-1's tablet without permission and was holding it out of his reach." The crowd listened intently. Do-hyun's live stream now showed comments flowing in from every human settlement in the solar system. Many were from families with special needs children, sharing their own stories of discrimination in space. "And what was my son's response to this treatment?" the Admiral asked. "Sir," Ta-1 remained calm and polite throughout the incident. He repeatedly requested the return of his property and attempted to de-escalate the situation by offering to leave. His behavior was exemplary and professional. Captain Young-ho nodded in agreement. "That matches the station's security footage, which I've just reviewed. The footage also shows that this is not the first time these officers have engaged in discriminatory behavior." Officer Park's face paled at these words. Officer Han looked at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sun Mi took a deep breath and continued. "Admiral, if I may add something." When he nodded, she turned to face the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I was struggling with a complex navigation calculation. Tai-1 saw me working late in the command center. He didn't just offer to help, he showed me a completely new way to look at the problem. His unique way of seeing patterns helped me solve an issue that had stumped several senior officers. Tai-1 blushed at her words, but stood straight and proud. His tablet was still extended toward Officer Park, the teaching program glowing softly on the screen. "The Space Force talks about diversity," Sun Mi continued, her voice growing stronger. "We say we want different perspectives, new ways of thinking. But when those differences appear in forms we don't expect, some of us forget our principles. Tai-1 reminds us every day what those principles truly mean." The Admiral placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Your testimony will be part of the official record." He looked at the two officers, his expression firm but not unkind. "This incident will require a formal response. But first, I believe Officer Park has a decision to make." All eyes turned to Officer Park, who stared at Tai-1's outstretched tablet. The moment stretched out, filled with tension and possibility. In that silence, everyone could feel the weight of change hanging in the air, waiting to see which way it would fall. Officer Park looked at the tablet in Tai-1's steady hand. The screen showed a simple, beautiful program that explained complex space concepts through clear pictures and easy words. His fingers trembled as he finally reached out to take it. Admiral Kim watched quietly as Officer Park began to scroll through the program. The crowd held their breath. Do-hyun's live stream had now reached over 500,000 viewers across the solar system, all watching this moment of truth unfold. "This," Officer Park's voice cracked. "This is really good. Did you really make this yourself?" Tai-1 nodded. "Yes, I worked 6 months on it. Father helped me test it with different people." He stepped closer to Officer Park, pointing at the screen. "See this part? It shows how space stations stay in orbit. I made the pictures simple, but the science is all correct." Officer Han moved closer to look at the screen over his partner's shoulder. His eyes widened as he realized the depth of knowledge behind the simple design. The program wasn't just for children. It could help anyone understand space better. Admiral Kim cleared his throat softly. "Officers, I want you to understand something important." His voice was calm but carried throughout the silent corridor. "When I first joined the Space Force 30 years ago, Many people thought someone like me, a young man from a poor background, couldn't become an admiral. They were wrong. He placed his hand gently on Taiwan's shoulder. When I adopted my son 15 years ago, many people thought someone with Down syndrome couldn't live in space. They were wrong too. Every time someone says they can't or they shouldn't, it's an opportunity to prove them wrong. Captain Young-ho stepped forward with his datapad. Admiral, I have the officer's service records here. There are 3 previous complaints about discriminatory behavior. The crowd murmured, but Admiral Kim raised his hand for silence. Thank you, Captain. But today, we're not going to focus on past mistakes. We're going to focus on future improvements. He turned to the officers. Do you know why the Aldebarans chose to make contact with humans first, instead of the other species they had discovered? Both officers shook their heads. They told me it was because humans had something special, the ability to learn from our mistakes and become better. They saw how we moved from fighting each other to working together in space. They saw how we learned to accept and celebrate our differences. Taiwan stepped forward again. Father, may I show them the special part of my program? Admiral Kim smiled. Of course, son. Taiwan took his tablet back for a moment and pressed a few buttons. The screen changed to show a beautiful simulation of Earth seen from space. As he adjusted the controls, the view moved through the solar system, showing all the places where humans now lived and worked. See, Taiwan said proudly. We are all different, but we all share the same stars. The program shows this in 7 languages, including Aldebaran Sign Language, because space belongs to everyone. Officer Park's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his prejudice hit him. Tears formed in his eyes as he looked at the boy he had mocked just minutes ago. I was wrong, he said softly. I was very wrong. Admiral Kim looked at the 2 officers standing before him in the crowded corridor of Europa Station. Officer Park's admission of wrongdoing had changed the atmosphere completely. The tension in the air had turned into something different, a feeling of possibility and hope. Your admission of error shows courage, Officer Park, Admiral Kim said. It's often harder to admit a mistake than to keep defending it. Now we must decide what happens next. Captain Young-ho stepped forward with his datapad, ready to begin disciplinary procedures, but the Admiral raised his hand to stop him. Before we make any decisions, Admiral Kim said, I want everyone to watch something. He turned to his son. Taiwan, would you show us the video you made last month? The one about your experience living on the station. Taiwan nodded and adjusted his tablet settings. A large holographic display appeared in the air, visible to everyone in the crowd. The video began playing, showing Taiwan's daily life on Europa Station. The video showed Taiwan helping younger children learn about space safety. It showed him working with the station's maintenance crew, using his pattern recognition skills to check equipment. It showed him in the hydroponics garden, carefully tending to plants that provided food for the station. I made this video, Taiwan explained as it played, to show that everyone can help make space better, even if we are different. Officer Han watched the video with tears in his eyes. We never knew, he whispered. We never bothered to know. Admiral Kim nodded. That's often the root of prejudice. We don't bother to know each other. So here is what we're going to do. He turned to address not just the officers, but the entire crowd and the hundreds of thousands watching through Do-hyun's live stream. Starting next week, Officers Park and Han will begin a new assignment. Instead of regular security duties, they will spend 3 months working with our station's education department. They will help Taiwan expand his teaching program to reach more people. Officer Park looked up in surprise. He had expected punishment, not an opportunity to learn. Additionally, the Admiral continued, they will take part in our new sensitivity training program, which will become mandatory for all security personnel across the Space Force. But they won't just be students. I want them to share their experience and what they've learned from it. Lieutenant Sunma stepped forward. Sir, I would like to volunteer to help coordinate this program. Excellent suggestion, Lieutenant, Admiral Kim said. And Do-hyun, would you be willing to help document this process? The solar system needs to see this journey of change. Do-hyun nodded eagerly, his recording device still streaming live. Tae-won looked at the officers who had bullied him earlier. His face showed no anger, only hope. Will you help make my program better? He asked them. You can help me add security information to teach people how to stay safe in space. Officer Park wiped his eyes and stood straighter. Yes, he said firmly. I would be honored to help. And I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. Admiral Kim smiled at his son's forgiveness and the officer's sincerity. He addressed the crowd one final time. Today, we've all witnessed something important. We've seen that change is possible. That understanding can replace fear. That kindness can overcome prejudice. Let this be the beginning of something new on Europa Station. The crowd began to applaud, the sound echoing through the station's corridors. On screens across the solar system, comments poured in supporting this approach to justice, one that focused on learning and growth rather than punishment. 3 months after the incident on Europa Station, the Space Force had changed in ways that surprised everyone. The security office, once known for its strict and sometimes unfriendly approach, had become a model of inclusive behavior. Officer Park and Officer Han had played a big part in this transformation. On this particular morning, Officer Park stood in front of a classroom full of new security recruits. His uniform was the same, but his face showed a new kind of confidence, the kind that came from growing as a person. Before we start today's lesson, he said to the class, I want to share a story with you. It's about the day I learned what real strength means. He touched a button, and Taiwan's teaching program appeared on the large screen behind him. In another part of the station, Officer Han worked with a group of children in the education center. Some of the children had special needs, others did not, but all of them were learning together. Han had discovered he had a talent for helping young people feel safe and included. Officer Han, a young girl with autism, asked, Can you show us again how the airlock safety systems work? Her words came slowly, but Han waited patiently, just as he had learned to do. Of course, he smiled, pulling up Taiwan's program. Remember what Taiwan always says, space safety is for everyone. Lieutenant Sunmei walked through the station's corridors, checking on the progress of the new training programs. She carried a data pad with impressive statistics. Complaints about discriminatory behavior had dropped to nearly zero, and more people with different abilities had applied to work on the station than ever before. She stopped at the hydroponics garden, where Taiwan was teaching a group of visiting officials from Earth. He stood confidently among the growing plants, explaining how the garden helped feed the station's residents. The plants are like people, he told them, speaking carefully but clearly. They all grow differently. Some need more water, some need less. Some grow tall, some stay small. But they all help make the air we breathe. They all matter. The officials nodded, taking notes. One of them, a senior administrator from Space Force headquarters, looked particularly impressed. Your son's approach to teaching is remarkable, she told Admiral Kim, who stood nearby. We want to implement this program across all our stations. Admiral Kim watched proudly as Taiwan answered questions from the officials. Do-hyun, who had become the official documentarian of the station's transformation, recorded everything. His earlier video of the incident had now been viewed by millions, but more importantly, his follow-up documentaries about the positive changes had inspired similar programs throughout human space. In the security office break room, Officer Park sat with Officer Han, reviewing their next lesson plan. The wall behind them displayed a new Space Force motto, different abilities, shared stars. It had been Taiwan's idea, and the Space Force had adopted it officially. Remember how we used to think? Officer Park asked his partner quietly, about who belonged in space and who didn't. Officer Han nodded. We were so wrong. And look at us now, teaching others about inclusion. Sometimes I think we learned more than we taught. Through the window, Jupiter's great red spot swirled as always, but the station around it had changed. The corridors now had clearer signs with both words and pictures. The computer systems had new interfaces that could adapt to different users' needs. Even the emergency procedures had been updated to ensure everyone could understand them. The Space Force had discovered that making things accessible for some made things better for all. As Admiral Kim had predicted, what started as a response to discrimination had become a movement for positive change throughout human space. 1 year after the incident that changed Europa Station, hundreds of people gathered in the station's main hall for a special ceremony. The hall had been decorated with the flags of all human space colonies, and a large screen showed live feeds from stations and settlements across the solar system. Taiwan stood at the podium, wearing a new blue uniform with the Space Force Education Division insignia. At 16, he had grown taller, and his voice was stronger, but his kind smile remained the same. Behind him sat his father, Admiral Kim, along with Officer Park, Officer Han, Lieutenant Sun Mi, and many others who had been part of the story. Welcome to the opening of the Kim Institute for Inclusive Space Exploration, Taiwan said clearly, looking at the audience with confidence. 1 year ago, something bad happened here, but my father taught me that bad things can lead to good changes if we learn from them. The audience applauded. Among them were children and adults with various abilities, all wearing space training uniforms. They were the first class of the new institute, people who might once have been told they didn't belong in space. Officer Park, now wearing the insignia of the Institute's Security Training Division, stepped forward to speak. "A year ago, I was the person who thought some people didn't belong in space," he said honestly. "Today, I help teach space safety to everyone. And I learned that when we make space safer for some people, we make it safer for all people." Officer Han nodded from his place among the Institute's teaching staff. He had helped design new emergency procedures that everyone could understand, no matter how they communicated. These procedures had already saved lives on 3 different space stations. Lieutenant Sun Mi, recently promoted to captain, presented the Institute's first-year achievements. "Our teaching programs have reached 50 space stations," she reported. "Over 10,000 people have completed our inclusive space training, and the Space Force has changed its rules to welcome people of all abilities." Do Hyun, who had recorded everything since that first day, played a special video. It showed how the station had changed. The corridors now had clear signs with pictures and words. The computers had screens that could change to help different people use them. The gardens had places where people in wheelchairs could work with the plants. Admiral Kim finally stood to speak. "When I adopted my son," he said, looking at Taiwan with pride, "many people said a child with Down syndrome couldn't live in space. Today, my son helps run an institute that teaches everyone about space. He proved those people wrong, and he helped make space better for everyone." The Admiral gestured to the screen behind him, where the faces of the Aldebaran ambassadors appeared. The alien beings made their sign language gestures, which Taiwan's program translated. "Humanity grows stronger when it accepts all its children. We are proud to support the Kim Institute." As the ceremony ended, Taiwan walked through the crowd, greeting everyone. He stopped to help a young girl with a hearing aid adjust her space suit communication system. Then he showed a boy in a wheelchair how to use the new airlock controls. Each person he helped reminded everyone of why the Institute was important. Back in the security office where everything had started 1 year ago, Officer Park's old badge hung in a small display case. Under it was a simple message: "From this mistake, we learned to be better." Next to it hung a picture of the first graduating class of the Kim Institute. People of all abilities, ready to explore space together. The story of the boy who was bullied had become the story of how humanity learned to be better. As Taiwan had said in his speech, space is big enough for everyone. We just needed to learn how to make room.